Hey guys, welcome back to another very calm, very unnecessarily long historical bedtime story. Tonight, we're not talking about kings or queens who couldn't keep it together. Nope, tonight, we're going under the sea. So get comfortable, dim the lights, pretend you're floating somewhere warm, maybe holding a cup of tea you'll forget to finish. Because tonight, we're sinking slowly into the myth, the mess, and the strangely persistent obsession known as Atlantis. That's right, the Lost City. You've heard about it since grade school, or maybe from that one Ancient Aliens rerun that came on after midnight. The city that supposedly vanished under the waves, taking with it its great wisdom, its people, and probably a few marble statues nobody asked for. It's the mythical, maybe metaphorical, maybe sort of real island civilization that's been haunting human imagination for almost 2,500 years. And we owe it all to one man. A man who never visited Atlantis, never saw it, and honestly might have made the whole thing up just to make a philosophical point. Yes, I'm talking about our favorite ancient gossip columnist, Plato. Let's start there. So, picture it. Athens around 360 BCE. The air smells like olive oil, questionable democracy, and sandal leather. Philosopher Plato is sitting around, probably annoyed at everyone, as usual. He's just written his famous works on justice and the ideal state, and he's clearly bored. So he decides to spice things up. He writes two dialogues, the Timaeus and the Critias. And in them he casually drops this little bombshell about a place called Atlantis. According to him, Atlantis was this massive island, somewhere beyond the Pillars of Heracles, which is the fancy ancient way of saying the Strait of Gibraltar. It was, allegedly, home to an advanced civilization, rich, powerful, and a little too proud for its own good. Think of it like ancient Greece, but if Greece had better plumbing and way worse humility. Plato describes Atlantis as having everything: fertile land, great architecture, endless natural wealth, and of course, an elite class of demigods who ruled over everyone else. Because apparently even utopias can't resist a good old-fashioned hierarchy. And it gets better. Plato says that the Atlanteans were originally half human, half divine, descendants of Poseidon, the god of the sea, and, incidentally, someone who would have had an amazing PR team today. Poseidon, according to Plato, fell in love with a mortal woman named Cleito, built her a whole island home, and had 10 sons with her. Because, Poseidon believed in quantity over quality. These 10 sons then divided the island among themselves, creating 10 kingdoms of Atlantis, each with beautiful palaces, shining walls, and a suspicious amount of gold. It all sounded perfect? Too perfect. And as every good bedtime story reminds us, perfect civilizations never last long. Plato says that as generations passed, the Atlanteans lost their divine spark. They became greedy, arrogant, and started picking fights with everyone, especially the Greeks, which is the most Plato thing ever. He invents a perfect civilization just to show how Greece could hypothetically destroy it. So, in this very casual myth within a dialogue, he claims that the gods got annoyed, sent a bunch of earthquakes and floods, and poof, Atlantis vanished into the sea in a single day and night. And that, apparently, was that. A moral lesson about hubris, moderation, and not annoying Zeus with your overconfidence.
But the funny part is, Plato never actually said it was a myth. He framed it as a story told to him by Solon, the famous Athenian lawmaker, who allegedly heard it from Egyptian priests centuries earlier. Because nothing says reliable source like, "My friend's cousin's uncle in another country said so."
Now, here's where it gets weird. Plato's students, including Aristotle, didn't buy it. Aristotle famously shrugged and said, "The man who invented Atlantis also destroyed it," which is philosopher speak for, yeah, he made that up. But over time, people just couldn't let it go. They wanted Atlantis to be real. They needed it to be real. Because who doesn't want to believe there was once a shining civilization that vanished mysteriously under the waves? It's the ultimate lost treasure fantasy, a blend of mystery, tragedy, and FOMO. Fast forward a couple thousand years, and Atlantis becomes a full-time obsession. Writers, explorers, theologians, mystics, everyone wanted a piece of it. Some said it was in the Mediterranean. Some said it was in the Atlantic Ocean. A few, apparently bored geologists, even claimed it was somewhere near Antarctica. Because when in doubt, just pick a continent and go with it. Let's float for a moment into the Renaissance, because that's when things really start to get spicy. By the 15th century, Europe was rediscovering the classics, and also rediscovering its ability to make everything about itself. Plato's text gets reprinted, and suddenly every scholar with access to a quill and an overactive imagination starts locating Atlantis somewhere new. In 1492, Columbus sets sail for Asia and ends up in the Caribbean. And some people immediately go, "Oh, maybe he found Atlantis." Because obviously, if you accidentally bump into a new continent, it must be the one Plato was talking about. The Spanish chroniclers of the New World even described the Aztecs and Incas as descendants of the Atlanteans, because, sure, why not mix colonial guilt with Greek mythology?
Then there's Francis Bacon, that overachieving English philosopher who couldn't stop writing manifestos. In 1627, he publishes The New Atlantis, a book that doesn't even pretend to be about Plato's version, but totally rides the hype. Bacon's Atlantis is basically a science fiction utopia where people use reason and science to make life perfect. It's clean, organized, and deeply British. So obviously everyone ignores the part where the real Atlantis was destroyed for arrogance. But the real modern Atlantis craze didn't begin until the 19th century. Enter Ignatius Donnelly, the self-taught American politician, amateur historian, and professional over-explainer. In 1882, he publishes Atlantis, the Antediluvian World, and in it he argues that Atlantis wasn't just real, it was the cradle of all civilization. According to Donnelly, Atlantis was where agriculture, writing, architecture, and probably good hair originated. Every ancient culture, from Egypt to the Mayans, was supposedly just a descendant of this one perfect society that sank under the ocean. Which is a fun theory if you ignore the total lack of evidence. But people loved it. Victorian readers couldn't get enough of lost continents, especially when mixed with pseudoscience and a dash of racism. Because, of course, some writers after Donnelly decided that Atlanteans were a master race who spread culture everywhere, which was basically 19th century code for we want to feel superior, but with extra steps. And then came Madame Blavatsky, the founder of Theosophy, who took Donnelly's idea and turned it up to 11. In her 1888 book, The Secret Doctrine, she claimed Atlantis was home to the fourth root race, a spiritually advanced people who could move objects with their minds, talk to gods, and occasionally destroy themselves in global cataclysms. It was like Atlantis meets X-Men, but slower. This idea bled into early 20th century occultism, then drifted through esoteric groups, Nazi pseudo-archaeology, and eventually into mid-century science fiction. By the 1960s, Atlantis wasn't just a myth, it was basically a multiverse franchise before Marvel got there. Let's take a soft pause here. If you're still awake, congratulations. If not, you're probably dreaming of marble palaces and underwater ruins. Either way, let's keep drifting. Because while the philosophers and mystics were busy arguing, the scientists eventually joined the party too. Archaeologists and oceanographers began asking, okay, but what if Plato was describing something real, just distorted by time? One of the earliest, maybe there's something to it, theories came from the idea that Atlantis could have been inspired by the Minoan civilization. Now, the Minoans were this incredibly advanced Bronze Age culture that lived on the island of Crete around 2000 BCE. They had complex palaces, plumbing, art, trade networks, basically everything you'd expect from a society that definitely thought it was better than everyone else. And then, around 1600 BCE, the nearby island of Thera, now Santorini, erupted, one of the largest volcanic eruptions in recorded history. It wiped out settlements, sent tsunamis across the Aegean, and plunged nearby regions into chaos. It's not hard to imagine how, centuries later, someone could have heard stories about this powerful island civilization that vanished in a single day and night. Add a few gods, a moral lesson, and Plato's flair for the dramatic, and you've got Atlantis. Was that what Plato meant? Maybe. Was it real? Possibly inspired by something. But did it have flying crystal ships and psychic dolphins? Probably not. Still, it's comforting to think that the myth wasn't entirely invented, that it's a kind of cultural echo of a real disaster, passed down through centuries like an ancient bedtime story gone rogue.
Let's drift a bit further down the timeline to the 20th century, where the Atlantis craze evolves from polite speculation into full-blown obsession. By now, Atlantis was everywhere. Books, magazines, early documentaries, and eventually late-night radio shows where people swore they'd found it. One guy claimed it was under the Sahara. Another said it was near Cuba. One even insisted it was buried under Antarctica, which feels like overkill, but okay. And then came the Edgar Cayce crowd, the sleeping prophet of the 1930s, who gave psychic readings about Atlantis while literally asleep. Because of course he did. Cayce claimed that Atlanteans were a technologically advanced society that used crystals for energy, and that their souls reincarnated into modern humans. Which is a beautiful thought, if you ignore how impractical it sounds to power your civilization with giant quartz lamps. Cayce also predicted that the ruins of Atlantis would rise again near the Bahamas in 1968 or 1969, which, depending on your belief system, either did or did not happen. Because in 1968, off the coast of Bimini, divers found a strange formation that looked suspiciously like a road made of massive stone blocks. They called it the Bimini Road, and immediately people started screaming, "Atlantis found!" Turns out the road was just naturally occurring limestone. But of course, facts have never been particularly good at killing a good myth. So here we are, drifting at the edge of legend and geology, somewhere between Plato's imagination and the ocean floor. Atlantis, the city that probably never existed, has outlived every empire, every conqueror, and every philosopher. It refuses to die, even though it's supposed to be underwater. And maybe that's the point. Atlantis isn't just a city. It's a story about us, our vanity, our curiosity, and our relentless need to believe that somewhere, beneath all the noise, there's a lost paradise waiting to be rediscovered. Let's float over to another layer of this myth, where historians, geologists, and the occasional psychic keep trying to pin down exactly where this not-so-real city might be hiding. Because if history teaches us anything, it's that humans are very bad at letting things go.
Hey, still awake? If you are, congratulations. You've made it through Plato, the philosophers, and a few thousand years of people arguing over a story that probably came from a man who just needed a better editor. But don't close your eyes yet, or do. You can listen with one ear if you're halfway asleep. Because now we're drifting into the part of history where Atlantis leaves the scrolls and enters the newspapers. The age of explorers, inventors, conspiracy theorists, and everyone in between. It's the 20th century, a magical time when you could publish a book about literally anything and someone would believe it. Let's start in the early 1900s, when science was doing its best to be serious and pseudoscience was doing its best to dress up as science. You've got archaeologists digging up Egypt, geologists mapping the seafloor, and meanwhile, a growing crowd of Atlantis believers waving their hands in the back like, "Excuse me, what if it's all connected?" In 1919, a Scottish writer named Lewis Spence publishes The Problem of Atlantis. It's a very earnest, very long book where he insists that Plato's story must have a factual basis. He basically argues that Atlantis was a cultural bridge between the Old World and New World. The reason we find pyramids in both Egypt and Central America. Which, to be fair, is a good observation if you ignore the fact that people on different continents can both independently invent triangles. But Spence's book landed right at the perfect moment. Europe was recovering from World War I. People were tired, disillusioned, and desperate for a sense of lost greatness. And Atlantis, the idea of a perfect world destroyed by its own arrogance, felt relatable. So the myth caught a second wind. By the 1930s, the whole Atlantis craze had gone global. This was the golden age of exploration. People were diving into jungles, deserts, and ocean trenches, all convinced that they would be the one to find the lost city. One of the loudest voices at the time was, of course, our old friend Edgar Cayce, the sleeping prophet. And if you thought psychic readings about ancient underwater civilizations sounded niche, you'd be surprised. Cayce had hundreds of followers. He claimed that the Atlanteans were a super-advanced race who invented laser energy, flying machines, and some kind of death ray, which, given that his followers were living through the Great Depression, probably sounded like the future they were waiting for. Cayce's predictions got oddly specific. He said that Atlantis would begin to rise again near the Bahamas in 1968 or 1969, which, as we mentioned earlier, lined up perfectly with the Bimini Road discovery. A neat coincidence, or, depending on your level of skepticism, the best accidental PR stunt in history. The press ate it up. Newspapers ran headlines like "Atlantis Found" and "Mysterious Underwater Structures Baffle Scientists." Except when the scientists showed up, they were mostly baffled by how many people were suddenly scuba diving without any idea what limestone looked like.
Let's take a slow breath here. Imagine yourself underwater. The sound of your breathing echoing through your scuba mask. Sunlight drifting through the waves above you. And somewhere in the distance, a rock formation that might or might not be the ruins of a lost world. That was the 1960s Atlantis mood in a nutshell. People were tired of war, politics, and reality in general. So diving into the myth of Atlantis wasn't just escapism, it was practically therapy. Magazines ran features on the secrets beneath the sea. Documentaries narrated by men with soothing British accents assured viewers that we are closer than ever to discovering the truth. And bookstores started filling up with pastel-covered paperbacks about Lemuria, Mu, and other lost continents that nobody could quite define. Atlantis had become less of a place and more of a genre. Now, the 1970s took this energy and said, let's make it weird. This was the decade when everyone suddenly decided they were an amateur archaeologist, as long as they had a diving license and a theory. One of the standout cases came from the French oceanographer Jacques Cousteau. Cousteau, unlike the psychics, was actually a scientist. But even he got roped into the Atlantis conversation.
In 1973, he explored the island of Santorini, the same volcanic island many historians believe inspired Plato's story. Cousteau's team found ancient ruins buried in ash, evidence of a thriving civilization destroyed by the Thera eruption. He didn't claim it was Atlantis, but of course, every headline the next day said Cousteau found Atlantis, because accuracy never sells as well as mystery. At the same time, over in the United States, Atlantis became part of the New Age movement. Crystals, reincarnation, past lives, spiritual energy, all of it somehow tied back to Atlantis. You could buy Atlantean healing stones in California, read The Lost Teachings of Atlantis in a yoga studio, and attend workshops promising to unlock your ancient Atlantean DNA. Apparently, we all have it. It's just very shy. It's almost poetic. Plato meant the story as a warning against hubris. And 2,000 years later, people were selling that hubris in the form of turquoise necklaces.
Now, not everyone was convinced. Serious archaeologists and historians spent most of the century politely and then not so politely, saying, "There's no evidence." But Atlantis had become unstoppable. Even the skeptics had to talk about it, because every time someone released a new theory, Atlantis would trend again, before trending was even a thing. For example, in the 1980s, a Russian scientist named Vladimir Abruchev suggested that Atlantis wasn't in the Atlantic at all, but under the Arctic ice. Meanwhile, an American engineer proposed it was in the Sahara Desert. A British team claimed it was near the Azores, and my personal favorite, one fringe author suggested it was actually the planet Mars. Sure. Why not? If you've already lost one city, might as well lose it in space. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, the Internet arrived, and Atlantis finally found its forever home. Message boards, chat rooms, early YouTube documentaries, you name it, Atlantis was there. One week it was the Caribbean. The next week it was southern Spain. Every new satellite photo of the ocean floor became instant proof. There was a particularly viral case in 2009 when someone using Google Earth found what looked like a perfect grid pattern off the coast of Northwest Africa. Within hours, the headlines screamed, "Google Maps reveals Atlantis." It turned out it was just sonar mapping data from a ship, but that didn't stop thousands of comments declaring that they had covered it up. No one could ever quite define who they were, but apparently they had incredible Wi-Fi at the bottom of the ocean. Let's slow it down again for a moment. It's kind of funny, isn't it? For a place that's supposed to be lost, Atlantis has never stopped being found. Every few years, someone claims they've solved it,
They find a new map, a new clue, a new mysterious shape in the sand. And every time, it's not quite right, but it doesn't matter. Because the idea of Atlantis isn't about accuracy, it's about longing. Longing for a world that made sense, for knowledge we think we've lost, for proof that once humanity was wiser and better than it is now. Atlantis is nostalgia for a golden age that probably never existed, which, come to think of it, makes it the most human story ever told.
Still, let's not completely dismiss the serious theories. There are some genuinely interesting historical parallels that might have inspired Plato's imagination. One theory places Atlantis near the island of Crete, linking it to the fall of the Minoan civilization we mentioned earlier. Another suggests it could have been inspired by memories of the Black Sea flood around 5600 BCE, when rising sea levels submerged vast coastal lands. And some geologists think Plato's one day and night of misfortune might echo memories of real earthquakes and tsunamis that devastated Mediterranean cultures. In that sense, maybe Atlantis is real, not as a city, but as a composite memory of disaster, a cultural fossil of every time nature reminded people who was in charge. That's kind of beautiful, in a sleepy, existential way. But of course, humanity can't leave well enough alone. Every time someone proposes a sensible, grounded explanation, someone else comes along and adds spaceships. The Ancient Aliens crowd, for example, insists that Atlantis was a colony of extraterrestrial visitors who used anti-gravity technology and mind power, which, personally, sounds exhausting. If I had intergalactic travel, I'd probably skip the part where I drown an entire civilization. Still, those theories pull in millions of views, because deep down, people don't really want the mystery solved. They want to feel the mystery. To imagine that beneath the quiet ocean waves lies something extraordinary. Something that explains why we build, destroy, and build again. Today, the search for Atlantis continues, though in quieter, more scientific tones. Marine archaeologists explore ancient trade routes and sunken cities, not because they expect to find Atlantis, but because the real ruins beneath the sea are fascinating enough. Off the coast of Greece, Egypt, and India, researchers have found entire cities swallowed by time. Temples, harbors, pottery, real evidence of human life meeting the sea. Every discovery adds another layer to the myth, as if the ocean itself is whispering, "You're getting warmer." And maybe that's why Atlantis endures, not as a destination, but as a metaphor, a reminder that knowledge, like civilization, is always half submerged. So where does that leave us? Thousands of years after Plato's casual thought experiment, we've built an entire cultural ecosystem out of it. Books, movies, video games, conspiracy channels, all orbiting this one word, Atlantis. And it keeps evolving.
Some see it as a lost paradise, others as a warning, and some just see a really good excuse to go scuba diving with a camera. But the myth persists because it mirrors something we can't quite let go of. The belief that humanity once had perfection, and somehow, through arrogance or fate, we lost it. It's comforting, in a melancholic way, to think that our flaws are ancient too. So as you drift off, imagine the quiet ocean floor. Imagine marble pillars and coral gardens, ancient walls softened by centuries of tides. Imagine, maybe, that somewhere out there, Plato's imagination left behind a few real stones, a reminder that ideas can be more durable than empires. Atlantis might not exist, but the search for it will never end. And maybe that's the real story. Let's float over one last time to where myth and history blur, where the dream of Atlantis becomes a reflection of us, our hopes, our hubris, and our endlessly curious need to find meaning in the deep.
Hey there, dreamers. If you're still with me, that means either you've developed a healthy curiosity about mythical underwater civilizations, or you're too comfortable to find the stop button. Either way, welcome back. We've drifted through Plato, prophets, and scuba divers. Now we arrive at the last gentle current, the one that carries Atlantis into the world we actually live in. A world of movie trailers, theme parks, and PowerPoint presentations about lost wisdom. Because somehow the city that never existed became one of the most profitable places on Earth. Let's start with the obvious. Pop culture ate Atlantis alive. In the 20th century, film and TV turned the myth into a cinematic goldmine. Hollywood loves a mystery, especially one with both ruins and water. In 1913, a silent film called Atlantis was released, basically a melodrama about a doomed ocean liner. Not exactly faithful to Plato, but hey, audiences liked boats. Then came 1939's Atlantis, the Lost Continent, which was really just an excuse to put togas and lava in the same frame. By the time Disney showed up in 2001 with Atlantis, the Lost Empire, the myth had been rebooted more times than Batman. This version gave us glowing crystals, flying machines, and a princess with perfect hair despite the humidity. It wasn't historically accurate, obviously, but it nailed something important, the sense that Atlantis represents lost potential. The idea that humanity once had everything and just misplaced it. And if you've ever sat through a late-night rerun of Stargate Atlantis, you've seen the same idea recycled again. That somewhere in the universe, there's a shining city waiting to be rediscovered by a bunch of overconfident scientists with matching uniforms. Atlantis became shorthand for advanced but doomed.
a narrative template. Every time a sci-fi writer wants to say, "We built something amazing and then blew it," Atlantis quietly waves from the back row and says, "I did it first." Of course, the myth also leaked into music. Donovan sang Atlantis in 1968, whispering his way through the legend like a man halfway between enlightenment and nap time. Then came a parade of rock bands, symphonies, and even electronic DJs, naming tracks after the lost city, because Underwater Ancient Utopia Remix just sounds cooler than track 7. If you've ever relaxed to ambient ocean sounds on Spotify, congratulations, you've basically been to Atlantis without the airfare.
But Atlantis isn't just pop culture's pet myth. It's also been weirdly important for philosophy. Not the old-school kind where people wear togas and argue about forms, but the modern kind where we look at the world and wonder why we keep repeating ourselves. Plato's original lesson still rings out quietly beneath all the movie explosions, that civilizations collapse not because of fate, but because of hubris. Because we get too confident, too sure we're untouchable. Every few decades, someone rediscovers that message, usually after something inconvenient happens. Say, an empire falls, a market crashes, or the Wi-Fi goes out. And suddenly, the think pieces appear. Have we become Atlantis? Spoiler, yes, at least a little bit. Now, in the academic world, Atlantis remains a sort of guilty pleasure. Most historians politely roll their eyes when it comes up, then proceed to write 300-page papers explaining why it's still fascinating. Because it is fascinating, not as archaeology, but as psychology. Atlantis tells us what people wish history looked like. Perfect symmetry, glorious technology, moral downfall followed by poetic justice. It's the ideal bedtime story for adults, comfortingly tragic, safely distant, and full of meaning you can project onto anything. And speaking of projection, let's talk about tourism. If you've ever stayed at the Atlantis Resort in the Bahamas, you've experienced the modern commercialization of myth in its purest form. There are marble columns, dolphin lagoons, and an aquarium styled to look like sunken ruins. It's Plato meets Vegas, the lost city reimagined as a luxury buffet with water slides. It's kind of poetic, actually. A civilization that once sunk because of excess and pride, now reborn as a hotel that literally sells excess and pride by the hour. Somewhere, Plato is rolling his eyes so hard it's creating a small tremor in the afterlife. Let's float a little deeper into the quiet. Beyond the movies and the marketing, Atlantis still surfaces whenever people feel disillusioned. During the Cold War, both sides used it as a metaphor for technology gone wrong, for power without wisdom. Writers described atomic bombs as the new flood. If you read between the lines, they were all saying the same thing. We've built Atlantis again,
and we know how the story ends. Even environmentalists picked up the metaphor. Rising seas, melting ice, vanishing coastlines. Atlantis became the cautionary tale of the Anthropocene. The lost city beneath the waves isn't ancient anymore. It's Miami, it's Venice, it's anywhere with beachfront property and bad policies. So, somehow, a story told by a philosopher in 360 BCE turned into a symbol of every human mistake since. Not bad for a parable that might have been invented over lunch. Of course, the internet took all of this and said, "Cool, but what if crystals?" If you search Atlantis on YouTube right now, preferably not right now since you're supposed to be drifting towards sleep, you'll find hours of soft-spoken narrators explaining the vibrational frequency of the Atlantean soul. There are whole subgenres of meditation music claiming to reconnect you with your Atlantean DNA. There are channels mapping ocean trenches in 3D and forums where people politely argue about which dimension Atlantis currently exists in. It's chaos. Peaceful, well-lit chaos. And honestly, it's kind of wonderful. Because even if it's nonsense, it's creative nonsense. It shows that humans never stopped being storytellers. We just swapped scrolls for screens and temples for comment sections. Let's slow down the current again. Imagine Plato sitting somewhere outside time watching all this. He writes a short moral tale about balance and humility, and thousands of years later, people are out here selling Atlantean bath salts on Etsy. He'd probably sigh, but also secretly be impressed. Because the story worked. It lived. It survived longer than most of his political ideas. Atlantis didn't need to be real to have impact. It just needed to feel real. And maybe that's the secret power of history in general. The line between myth and memory is thinner than we think. People don't pass down data. They pass down emotion, awe, fear, wonder, regret. Atlantis is just the emotional residue of countless lost worlds, real cities that vanished, real cultures that fell silent. The myth gives them a name. It turns every ruin into a reflection, every broken column into a whisper saying, "We were here." That's why the legend endures while facts fade, because myths are how we metabolize reality, slowly, beautifully, and slightly inaccurately. If you listen carefully, you can trace Atlantis through almost every civilization since, every empire that rose convinced it would last forever, every golden age that forgot how fragile it was. The Romans had their version. The Byzantines had theirs. Even in the Renaissance, people were already writing about their world as a fallen Atlantis, a nostalgic dream of purity they could never get back. And here we are now, streaming documentaries about lost cities on devices that rely on supply chains we barely understand. It's almost poetic. in the "oops, we've become the story again" kind of way. Let's glance at one more curious corner: science fiction. Atlantis became the seed for an entire genre, the Lost World narrative. From Journey to the Center of the Earth to Black Panther's Wakanda, the blueprint is the same: a hidden, advanced civilization that reflects our best and worst instincts. In a way, Atlantis never sank. It just relocated to space, to alternate dimensions, to the future. The myth evolved, like a particularly ambitious jellyfish. And through it all, the core idea remains strangely comforting, that knowledge isn't gone forever, just waiting to be rediscovered when we're ready. It's the bedtime version of optimism. Now, before you drift completely away, let's return to the surface, gently, slowly. Picture the Mediterranean again, a calm sea, moonlight folding over the water. Somewhere below, in the silence, the idea of Atlantis still hums like a distant current. Plato probably didn't mean to create an immortal story. He was just illustrating a point about morality and moderation. But myths are like ships. Once they set sail, you can't really steer where they go. Atlantis sailed far, through philosophy, religion, science, and cinema. It survived floods, wars, and bad CGI. It even survived the internet, which is saying something. So what's left for us, the modern dreamers listening in the dark? Maybe the lesson is simple. Every age builds its own Atlantis, a version of perfection that feels close enough to touch, but always slips away. And maybe that's okay, because without loss, there'd be no curiosity. Without mystery, there'd be no stories. And without stories, there'd be no reason to stay awake or to fall asleep to history. So, if your eyes are heavy now, good. That means the story did its job. The waves have flattened, the philosophers have gone quiet, and the city that never dies can rest for another night. Because, in a way, Atlantis isn't under the ocean. It's under our eyelids. That calm, glowing place we visit when the world above gets too loud. And every time you drift off wondering what came before us, you're visiting it again. The city that never was, but somehow always will be.
Hey again. Still here? That's impressive. Most people would have drifted off somewhere between the underwater crystals and the 19th century mystics. But you're still floating, still curious. And that's kind of fitting, because curiosity is exactly what Atlantis was meant to provoke. So let's swim back to the beginning, to Athens, to Plato, and to the quiet reason this myth exists at all. It's easy to forget that for Plato, Atlantis wasn't supposed to be a bedtime story. It was a thought experiment. Around 360 BCE, Athens was recovering from a rough patch. The Peloponnesian War had left it weakened. Democracy had become messy, and Plato, philosopher, idealist, and professional overthinker, was trying to figure out how to describe the perfect society. His answer was the Republic, a dialogue so dense that even his students probably pretended to understand it. But when he wrote Timaeus and Critias, he needed an example, a civilization that had everything, and then lost it all. Enter Atlantis, a perfect city that grew arrogant, a moral fable about power, pride, and the ocean's sense of humor. That's it. That's the whole point. Plato wasn't saying, go find it. He was saying, don't become it. And somehow, we missed the memo for the next 2,000 years. Let's take a slow walk through Plato's mindset. He believed that the world we see, the messy, imperfect, occasionally ridiculous one, was just a shadow of a higher reality. In his philosophy, perfection existed only in the realm of forms, pure, unchanging ideals that the real world could only imitate. So, when he described Atlantis, he wasn't documenting geography, he was sketching a moral geometry, a civilization that looked perfect but wasn't, a warning that even the most shining order can corrode from within. It's funny, we've spent centuries digging for ruins when the real treasure was a paragraph about ethics.
But here's the twist. Even though Plato's point was philosophical, his story felt real. The way he described it, the details, the dates, the measurements, made it sound like a historical account. He said it was 9,000 years before Solon, and that it lay beyond the Pillars of Heracles. He even described its circular canals and shining temples in enough detail that future readers thought, wait, this sounds suspiciously like a place I can find with Google Earth. Maybe Plato did it on purpose. Maybe he knew that to teach humans a lesson, you have to wrap the moral in mystery. Because let's be honest, no one's staying up late to listen to a lecture on moderation. But tell them there's a lost city with gold walls and a god king? Now you've got their attention for 2,400 years. And that's the genius of it. Plato created the first viral story. He didn't just write philosophy. He built a meme that transcended time. It spread, mutated, adapted, changing with every era that retold it. For the Greeks, it was a moral allegory. For the Romans, a cautionary tale. For the Victorians, a mystery to solve. And for us, it's a YouTube thumbnail with dramatic music. Atlantis became a mirror, and each generation sees itself reflected in the waves. Now, let's talk about the part nobody really mentions. Plato might have written Atlantis as a dig at Athens. Think about it. He describes a powerful maritime empire, wealthy, cultured, and convinced of its superiority, which then collapses because it can't control its greed. Sound familiar? That's Athens. That's the empire Plato was watching fall apart in his own lifetime. Atlantis was never an alien continent. It was a philosophical roast. He basically said, hey, maybe we're not as perfect as we think we are. And the Athenians responded 2 millennia later by turning it into a travel destination. If you zoom out a bit, mentally, not on Google Maps, you'll notice how often humans repeat the Atlantis cycle. We build something amazing, we call it progress, we get comfortable, then overconfident, and eventually something cracks. It doesn't always sink under the sea. Sometimes it's just an economy, or a climate, or a social network. But the pattern's the same: hubris, decline, nostalgia. And then we look back and say, if only we could get it right next time. Atlantis is that feeling turned into geography.
Now, let's glide to something gentler. The philosophy of lost worlds in general. Every civilization invents one. The Sumerians had Dilmun, the Hebrews had Eden, the Chinese had Penglai, and modern people have, well, maybe the good old days. They're all the same longing. The idea that once there was harmony, and now we're just trying to remember how it felt. Maybe that's why Atlantis hits so hard. It's not just a lost place, it's a lost balance, a symbol for everything that slips through our fingers when we get too loud, too proud, too human. It's no wonder we keep rewriting it. Each version gives us hope that we might recover what we lost, or at least fall asleep believing we could. Let's pause here for a breath. Imagine you're standing on a cliff overlooking the sea. The sun is gone, the sky quiet. Somewhere below, the tide slides across ruins that may or may not exist. And for a moment, you understand why Plato wrote it. Not to scare anyone, not to mystify, but to remind us that wisdom, like cities, can drown, and that it's up to us to keep rebuilding it over and over again. That's not tragic, that's just human maintenance. Of course, being human, we can't stop turning every serious idea into a brand. So now we have Atlantean skincare, Atlantean diets, Atlantean NFTs. Plato's moral fable is now available in convenient, subscription-based form. He'd hate it, but he'd also probably laugh, softly, tiredly, because this, too, is part of the pattern. We take stories meant to humble us and use them to advertise our resilience. And maybe that's why Atlantis never dies, because the myth isn't about destruction, it's about persistence, of imagination, of storytelling, of people trying to make sense of being temporary. There's a quiet beauty in the way myths survive their creators. They lose the specifics, gain exaggeration, and somewhere in that process they become immortal. Atlantis doesn't need coordinates anymore.
It exists wherever people talk about what's been lost and what might be found again. It exists in every library, every campfire, every late-night whisper that starts with, "Do you ever think there was more?" It's the hum at the edge of curiosity, the sound that keeps historians, dreamers, and you awake just a little longer. Let's glide one last time toward the surface. The water grows lighter. The myth dissolves back into memory. You can almost see Athens again. Its hills, its marble, the same sea that once carried Plato's words across the centuries. Somewhere in that distant shimmer, the ghost of Atlantis waits, not as a ruin, but as an idea that refuses to sink. Maybe that's what Plato meant all along, that perfection doesn't live in marble walls or golden temples, but in our endless urge to imagine something better, even if we have to invent an island to describe it. So, if you're still awake, let's take that thought and set it gently beside you, like a seashell on the nightstand. Atlantis never needed to be found. It only needed to be remembered. Every time someone builds a city, every time someone warns of pride, every time someone, somewhere, tells a story to help another person drift into sleep. And now, as the waves flatten out and the philosophers finally stop talking, you can rest. Because the city that never dies has told its story again, and it's safe to let it fade. The ocean is quiet. The lamps of the lost city are dimming. And somewhere between myth and memory, Atlantis is waiting, softly, silently, for the next dreamer to find it.
Hey there, Night Owl. You made it through Plato's philosophy, Victorian pseudoscience, Disney divers, and about 12,000 years of imaginary history. And yet, you're still listening. That says something. Maybe about curiosity, maybe about insomnia, maybe both. So, let's drift a little longer, past the myth of Atlantis itself, into the world it accidentally created. Because while everyone was busy searching for one lost city, the earth quietly revealed dozens more. And each one whispered the same thing. We were real, too. Let's start close to where Atlantis supposedly was. The Mediterranean. That calm blue mirror of human civilization. Under those waters lie thousands of ruins. Not imaginary ones, but the real kind. The ones you can swim through if you're willing to get sand in your ears. There's Pablo Petri, off the coast of Greece. A city at least 5,000 years old, complete with streets, courtyards, and the foundations of homes. It sank quietly after an earthquake, centuries before Plato ever picked up his pen. Divers found it in 1967, and it immediately became one of those "maybe this is Atlantis" discoveries. Of course, it wasn't,
But that didn't stop anyone from trying to make it fit. Because every time we find a city under the sea, the myth of Atlantis stirs awake, like a ghost that refuses to be left out. A little farther east, off the coast of Egypt, there's Heraklion, sometimes called Thonis, depending on which ancient Greek or Egyptian you ask. It was once a thriving port, a gateway to the Nile Delta, filled with statues, temples, and traders from every corner of the Mediterranean. Then, sometime around the 2nd century BCE, the ground beneath it liquefied, literally melted from an earthquake and shifting silt, and the whole city slid into the sea. For almost 2,000 years, it was just a legend. Sailors told stories about a city beneath the waves, where statues stared up from the sand. Then, in 2000, a French marine archaeologist named Frank Godiot found it, nearly intact, resting in the mud. Huge granite statues, sphinxes, columns still standing upright. It looked like a set piece designed by Plato himself, a frozen echo of everything Atlantis was supposed to be. But unlike Atlantis, this one was real. And somehow that made it even sadder. Because it proved that cities really do disappear. Quietly, patiently, without divine punishment, just because the earth occasionally decides to rearrange itself.
There's something almost tender about that idea. We want tragedy to be dramatic. Lightning bolts, floods, the wrath of gods. But most loss is ordinary. Slow erosion. One small collapse after another until the familiar turns into legend. That's how memory works. That's how history works. And maybe that's how Atlantis works too. Let's float east for a moment, toward India's Gulf of Khambat. In 2001, sonar scans there revealed massive geometric patterns, walls, rectangles, what looked like streets, buried under 120 feet of water. For a moment, the headlines exploded. Atlantis of the East found. Archaeologists, of course, disagreed. The formations could have been natural, but mixed among them were artifacts, pottery, tools, carbon dated to nearly 9,000 years old. Maybe not a lost civilization, but at least proof that human hands had shaped the shore long before the sea took it back. And that's the real theme here, isn't it? The ocean always wins. We build, we decorate, we name things after ourselves, and the tide quietly files it all away. It's not punishment, it's housekeeping. The funny thing is, the earth doesn't even try to hide what it's done. It leaves hints everywhere. There's Yonaguni off the coast of Japan, a strange underwater terrace that looks uncannily like a pyramid. Some geologists say it's natural formation. Others swear you can see the steps carved by human hands.
Either way, the sea has polished it into something mythic. Divers swim down with flashlights, and for a few moments they swear they see walls, gates, even faces carved in stone. It doesn't matter whether it's real. It feels like Atlantis, and that's enough. Maybe that's why humanity keeps going back to the same story. Because beneath all the measurements and speculation, Atlantis isn't about geography. It's about grief. We miss what we've lost, even when we never had it. We build these myths as a way of talking to the past, saying, "We see you, we remember." Atlantis is how we make peace with the idea that everything we build will eventually sink. And that's okay, as long as the story floats. If you close your eyes right now, you can almost picture what these cities looked like before the water came. People walking along bright stone roads, market stalls under linen canopies, children running past the harbor, fishermen mending nets, priests lighting lamps. Ordinary, noisy, beautiful life. And somewhere in the distance, a tremor, a wave, a moment too large to understand. The sound of a world going quiet. It's not hard to see why ancient storytellers turned those memories into moral tales. When something so big disappears, you can't just say it was an earthquake. You have to give it meaning. You have to imagine the gods were involved.
That impulse to explain, to find pattern, is why Atlantis still matters. We crave coherence. We want history to rhyme. We want loss to have a reason. So we tell ourselves stories about civilizations that flew too close to the sun, about divine justice, about lessons to be learned. But sometimes there isn't a lesson. Sometimes the sea just gets tired of holding still. And yet, somehow, we keep building anyway. Because the opposite of Atlantis isn't survival, it's giving up. Let's drift up a few millennia to our own time again. If you look at satellite images, you'll see entire modern coastlines changing shape, villages swallowed by rising seas, islands shrinking, shorelines redrawn. Every year, a few new Atlantises are born, not in myth, but in real time. There's Shishimaref in Alaska, crumbling into the Arctic Ocean. There's Jakarta, slowly sinking into its own bay. There's Tuvalu, where the waves lick closer every season. People there sometimes say, when the water comes, we'll become stories. And they're right. Every lost place becomes Atlantis eventually, not by name, but by memory. The ancient myth has finally caught up with us, only this time, it's not allegory, it's data. And that might be the quiet genius of Plato's story, that it wasn't just about the past, but a premonition of the future.
He warned that arrogance and greed could drown even the brightest city. And here we are, building glass towers, trading empires, and pretending the water isn't rising. It's poetic, if slightly depressing. But maybe that's the point of bedtime history, to make you sleepy enough to dream about fixing it. Still, there's something soothing about the cycle. Civilizations rise, they fall, and then someone finds the ruins and starts the story over again. We call it archaeology, but really, it's resurrection, a quiet defiance of forgetting. Each shard of pottery, each buried street, is proof that humans never really vanish. We just move deeper into the earth, waiting for someone to listen. And maybe that's what keeps the myth alive, listening. When you think about it, Atlantis is just an echo, a sound that bounces back from the depths, carrying traces of voices long gone. Plato heard it, so did Donnelly, and Blavatsky, and the scuba divers of the 1960s, and now you've heard it too, somewhere between history and lullaby. That echo connects us all. Every curious night owl who's ever looked at the ocean and thought, there's something down there. Maybe not gold, maybe not temples, but something older. Something that reminds us how fragile we are and how beautiful it is to try anyway. So let's close this long drift with a thought. Atlantis might never have existed, but every time we imagine it, we build it again. In stories, in art, in quiet moments before sleep. The city that never dies doesn't need stone walls anymore. It lives in the rhythm of waves, in the persistence of curiosity, in the hum of 1,000 storytellers who refuse to stop wondering. That's the real Atlantis, not lost, not found, just waiting, endlessly, beneath the surface of thought. And now, as the tide pulls back one last time, and your breathing settles into that slow, even pace, imagine the ocean floor, dark, vast, and peaceful. A few fish glide past the outlines of a forgotten street. A statue leans against coral, smiling faintly. A mosaic tile reflects the moonlight from far above. No drama, no tragedy, just the quiet dignity of something that was loved and left behind and remembered. The city sleeps, the story rests, and you can finally close your eyes.
Hey there, still awake? If you are, you've officially outlasted several empires and at least 3 sea level changes. Good job. We've talked about Plato, prophets, divers, and drowned cities. Now we come to something even stranger. A time when Atlantis stopped being a legend of the past and quietly became a blueprint for the future. Because somehow, a 2,400-year-old bedtime story ended up inspiring architects, engineers, and the occasional tech billionaire to build new worlds, just higher up with Wi-Fi. Let's start on dry land, or as dry as Dubai ever gets. The Palm Islands,
The world islands, the line city proposals out in the desert, they're all Atlantean at heart. Grand, geometric, perfectly planned, and quietly pretending that nature will play along forever. You can almost hear Plato whispering, "Did you people not read the ending?" Still, we keep doing it. Every generation wants to design the perfect city, self-sustaining, beautiful, symmetrical, with just enough artificial intelligence to feel smug about it. We call it smart infrastructure now, but really, it's the same dream, a controlled paradise that definitely won't sink. Probably. Even our science fiction refuses to move on. You can't throw a space probe without hitting an Atlantean reference. Every colony on Mars, every underwater base in a movie trailer, every neon blue holographic metropolis, they all carry the same DNA. The lost city, rebuilt, rebranded, now with better lighting. Writers call these places Neo-Atlantis, New Eden, Arcadia 2.0. It's comforting to think we're still reaching for the same impossible symmetry Plato sketched in the sand. Civilization as therapy. Build a new one, maybe this time it'll work. Technology companies have their own version of the myth. They don't call it Atlantis, they call it the cloud, a glowing, frictionless space where all knowledge is stored safely above the chaos below. Every photo, every file, every embarrassing tweet, suspended somewhere invisible, humming quietly like Plato's higher realm of forms. It's ironic. Atlantis sank. We responded by uploading everything to the sky. Opposite directions, same anxiety. We still can't stand the idea of losing what we've made. Meanwhile, under the real ocean, engineers are actually building cities, floating platforms off Japan, underwater hotels in the Maldives, subsea research labs with glass domes and espresso machines. Tourists pay to sleep beneath fish now because we've decided that the safest way to confront a flood myth is to monetize it. There's something both absurd and poetic about that, turning fear into architecture, turning cautionary tales into marketing copy. Come experience the wonder of Atlantis, but with room service. Let's drift into the quieter corners of modern myth-making, the digital ones. In video games, Atlantis shows up like an old friend who never updates their outfit. From Assassin's Creed to Tomb Raider to Minecraft mods, players keep exploring shiny ruins lit by eternal sunlight. You can even build your own version, because nothing says personal empowerment like recreating a civilization that destroyed itself. And in virtual reality, developers talk about immersive utopias, cities where people can live, work, and apparently never log off. Digital Atlanteans, swimming through pixels instead of water, still convinced they can design perfection if the servers hold. If Plato could see it, he'd probably squint and say, "Interesting, but you still didn't fix hubris."
Let's slow the current again. Why do we keep repeating this pattern, this need to rebuild paradise? Maybe because the myth of Atlantis isn't really about a place. It's about a mood, that quiet ache for improvement, for a version of humanity that finally gets it right. Every new invention, every social experiment, every TED Talk about rethinking civilization is just another verse in the same old song. We've replaced temples with tech conferences, priests with futurists, and sea gods with algorithms, but the rhythm's identical. We dream, we build, we overreach, we drown. Then we start again,
slightly soggier, and hopefully wiser. Even climate scientists borrow the language now. You'll see headlines like "Atlantis Reborn, the Future of Coastal Cities." It's less poetic when it's about Miami, but still. We talk about drowned worlds, sunken heritage, the blue frontier. We're writing the next chapter of the myth in real time. And maybe that's okay, because every retelling carries the warning forward that progress without humility eventually meets the tide. You can't negotiate with physics, but you can learn to float. Let's glance at something smaller, the personal Atlantean impulse. Not cities, not civilizations, just us. Every person builds their own little version of the lost city. Photo albums, journals, playlists labeled "Better Times." Private golden ages we visit when the present feels too loud. Memory is just another kind of archaeology, and nostalgia is the sea that keeps lapping at it. We all have ruins we like to swim through, moments that feel preserved in amber, not gone, just submerged. When you think of it that way, Atlantis is inside everyone, the part of the mind that keeps replaying what once was, hoping to find meaning in the echo. Let's float up for air, just enough to look around. The surface world keeps changing faster than ever, and yet the stories underneath barely move. Every shiny headline about the city of the future sounds suspiciously like a Greek dialogue with better fonts. Humans are consistent that way. We forget the moral, keep the aesthetic. We say we want wisdom, but mostly we want nice lighting and a good view of the ocean. And maybe that's not such a terrible flaw. At least it means we're still looking outward, still curious, still designing, still convinced we can balance beauty and survival. Let's imagine for a moment that Plato could visit one of our modern Atlantean projects, say, a glass-walled skyscraper eco-city rising from the Gulf. He'd step out of his chariot, look up, and say something like, "So, you learned to fly." Then he'd read the energy consumption report and mutter, perhaps not." But then he'd smile, slowly, approvingly, because he'd recognize what we're really doing. Trying again, failing again, with style. Every myth eventually turns into philosophy again. Atlantis started as one, drifted through religion, conspiracy, art, and entertainment, and now circles back as environmental ethics. The ocean rises, and we remember the story. We build smarter levees, greener buildings, quieter egos. Maybe that's progress. Maybe it's just repetition with solar panels. Either way, it keeps us humble. So, as the night settles in, think of how far this one little myth has traveled. From Plato's study in ancient Athens to your headphones in the 21st century. From ink on papyrus to pixels on a glowing screen. It crossed empires, religions, printing presses, satellites, and somehow kept its rhythm, a heartbeat beneath the noise of history. That's what stories do. They survive the flood. Let's end where we began. A calm ocean, a quiet imagination, a city that refuses to stay gone. Somewhere below the waves, the lamps of Atlantis flicker, not because they're real, but because they're remembered. And above the waves, in every glowing skyline and every whisper of innovation, you can still see the reflection, our endless attempt to rebuild the impossible. Maybe one day we'll get it right, or maybe we'll just keep telling the story, a little slower each time until it finally becomes the lullaby of civilization. The sea is calm now. Your pulse matches its tide. The myth has circled all the way back to silence. If you listen closely, you can almost hear Plato's pen scratching across the page again, writing the same story for the next dreamer in the next age. Sleep well, traveler. You've reached the surface. The city that never dies is resting, and so should you.
Hey, still here? That's okay. You don't have to move anymore. We're at the part of the night when even the ocean sounds tired. The lights are low, the air feels thick and warm, and the waves outside time are folding in on themselves. Atlantis has told its story. Now it just wants to sleep. Imagine the surface of the sea, flat as glass. Every sound muted, as if the world has put a finger to its lips. Down below, the water drifts through ruins that don't know they're ruins. Sand settles on old mosaics. Fish glide through doorways that once had hinges. Nothing mourns, nothing celebrates. It all just is. That's the secret the myth never told. Under the sea, there's no tragedy, only stillness. You can breathe slower now, in and out. If you listen, you might hear small things, the soft knock of pebbles in the tide, the creak of a forgotten pillar, your own pulse matching the current. The ocean has a heartbeat, and tonight it borrowed yours. Far above, the stars are looking down, the same way they did when Plato first wrote his fable. They don't care whether Atlantis was real. They just keep shining. Tiny reminders that light travels farther than loss. Maybe that's what stories are, too. Little lights, faint, stubborn, refusing to drown. Somewhere between waking and sleep, you might picture the city whole again. Streets swept clean, harbors filled, music drifting through open courtyards, people laughing softly, unaware that they're about to become legends. It's not a warning this time, just a memory that feels safe enough to visit. Let the story fade. Let the water close over it. Atlantis doesn't need to be found tonight. It only needs to rest, and so do you. Your thoughts can slow like silt settling. Your body can sink into the mattress the way marble sinks into the sand, gracefully, quietly, without resistance. If you dream, maybe you'll walk its streets for a moment. You'll see the soft glow of torches in the mist. You'll pass someone who looks suspiciously like Plato, arguing gently with a fisherman about metaphors. And you'll keep walking until the sound of the sea is the only language left. Then you'll wake, and the city will dissolve again, content to wait for another night. The waves are steady now. The story has no more words.
only the slow rhythm of breathing and the faint hum of a world that refuses to end. Sleep, traveler. The deep remembers you. And tomorrow, when the sun returns to the surface, Atlantis will still be there, not under the sea, but somewhere in the quiet part of your mind where all lost things go to be at peace.
Hey, you're still here. That's fine. Some stories don't end. They just linger, like the sound of water in a shell you forgot was at your ear. Atlantis is gone again, safely buried, peacefully dreaming. But the echo of it keeps circling back, asking a small question. What do we do with what survives? Think about how quiet the world is when everyone else is asleep. Streetlights hum, pipes whisper behind walls. Even silence has a pulse. That's the same rhythm the ocean keeps, the same rhythm that carried Plato's words all the way to you. Maybe that's the real map of Atlantis. Not coordinates, not depth charts, just that faint vibration between people who remember the same story for no practical reason at all. Every generation adds one shell to the pile, a new theory, a new city, a new dream, and the tide keeps collecting them, stacking them into a coral reef of human imagination. When historians dig through it later, they'll find more hope than ruin, because that's the one resource we never seem to run out of. You can let your thoughts drift now. The lessons already done, the morals have all fallen asleep at their desks. What's left is texture, a shimmer of blue light, a whisper that says, maybe. Maybe there were towers under the sea. Maybe it was all metaphor. Maybe the truth doesn't matter as much as the way it feels to keep searching. Breathe in once more. Let it out slowly. Feel the weight of the day slip off like sand through fingers. There's nothing left to understand tonight, only the soft echo of everything that has ever been lost and somehow still found its way into a story. If you listen carefully, you might hear voices from the deep, not warning, not pleading, just remembering. They sound a lot like your own thoughts when they finally stop arguing with the world. They say, we built, we fell, we told the tale. That was enough. So here we are, floating between myth and morning. The sky will lighten soon, and the sea will look ordinary again. But you'll know better. You'll know that beneath every calm surface, there's a library of echoes waiting for someone patient enough to hear them. That's all Atlantis ever wanted. Not worship, not proof, just to be heard once in a while. And tonight, you did. Now, let it fade. Let the water close behind the last word. Sleep easy. The story is complete.
Hey, you're almost back. The tide is pulling toward morning, and the first light is sliding across the water like a slow exhale. You can feel it, can't you? The world starting to move again. Quiet engines in the distance, the faint hum of everything returning. Atlantis is gone, but its echo still clings to the air, thin as salt, sweet as sleep. If you look down, the ocean doesn't show you ruins anymore, just reflections. Your own, mostly, drifting, changing shape with every ripple. Maybe that's what the myth was always for, to teach us how to see ourselves in water and not be afraid of the distortion. Plato's ink has long dried. The scrolls have faded, but the question he wrote lingers. What makes a civilization worthy of surviving its own reflection? He never answered it, of course. He just left it there, floating, for someone else to whisper over. For you, maybe. The sea is calmer now. No thunder, no warnings, just the long sigh of waves against the shore. Even the gulls sound half asleep. If you listen closely, you might hear the city breathing beneath the surface again, not struggling, not forgotten, just resting. Everything ends this way eventually. Empires, storms, nights, all of them soften into the same blue hush. You can let your thoughts wander back to the shore, feet on sand, light in your eyes, a day waiting, unhurried. The story stays behind, folded into the rhythm of the tide. It doesn't need you to remember every word. It just needs you to carry the calm. So take one more breath, in and out. Let the water fade into wind, and the myth fade into morning. The ocean will keep its secrets. The city will keep dreaming, and you get to wake.
Hey there. We made it. 10 parts, one long tide, and a few thousand years of pretending that a city at the bottom of the sea might still be watching us. If you're still awake, don't worry. The story is almost done. If you've already drifted halfway under, that's fine too. This ending was written to meet you wherever you are, between waking and water. When we first set out, Plato was sitting in his villa, scratching ink onto a wax tablet, trying to explain why humans can't handle perfection. Now the sun is creeping over whatever window you're near, and we've followed his idea all the way here, to the quiet place where myths dissolve into memory. The ocean has stopped moving fast. It just breathes. It feels old and kind the way tired things do. If you could see the seafloor right now, you'd find no glowing temples, no machines of light. You'd see coral growing over old shapes. You'd see time practicing patience. Everything humanity builds eventually becomes furniture for the sea. Columns turn into reefs. Statues shelter small fish. Even our monuments learn how to share space. Maybe that's the mercy hidden in loss, that nothing ever really vanishes, it just changes departments. Atlantis was never just a city. It was a conversation about what happens after brilliance. The Greeks thought of it as hubris. Modern people call it burnout. Different vocabulary, same fatigue. We create, we shine, we overheat. Then we fall silent long enough to remember that quiet has value. It's comforting, in a slow, sleepy way, to realize that even collapse can be graceful. The sea didn't punish Atlantis. It tucked it in. Now look how far the myth has traveled. Through philosophers, poets, Victorian dreamers, and the restless architects of the digital age. It's been drawn, filmed, coded, sold, remixed,
and somehow it still sounds like water hitting stone. That's what a real story does. It keeps its temperature. It doesn't matter if you tell it with marble, paper, or pixels. The heartbeat underneath stays the same. Maybe that's why people keep whispering the name, Atlantis. It rolls off the tongue like a sigh, like the moment before sleep catches you. The A rises, the S falls, and somewhere in between, you can almost hear a wave folding over itself. Plato would have liked that. He believed in forms, in the idea that beauty itself was eternal. He'd probably smile to know that a single name still sounds beautiful long after the facts have washed away. Let's step back a little, far enough to see the larger pattern. Every civilization writes a version of Atlantis. Every person lives one. You build a world, an idea, a family, a dream, and then slowly it changes form. Pieces drift away. What's left becomes memory, and memory becomes story. It's not tragedy. It's just how time composts meaning. The myth is a rehearsal for acceptance. If you listen carefully, you can still hear other lost cities breathing in the deep. Pavlopetri, Heracleion, Port Royal, Duarca. Real places, real lives, folded into the same slow current. They don't call for rescue. They just hum quietly, like people who've made peace with being misunderstood. That's what maturity sounds like in geological time. Sometimes I think the sea is the world's memory. It keeps everything that falls into it, rings, coins, empires, promises, and it doesn't judge. It just stores them in salt until someone is ready to remember. That's why stories feel a bit like waves. They leave and return, and each time they come back, they carry a different version of us. So what does the last light of Atlantis look like? Not gold, not marble. It's a soft glow, the color of dawn hitting deep water. It's knowledge turning into peace. It's the moment you stop needing to prove a myth and start understanding why people needed it in the first place. Because myths are just mirrors we can look into without flinching. They let us study our mistakes in poetic lighting. Take one more slow breath. The night has done its work. You've traveled from philosophy to dream and back to stillness. There's no moral left to recite, only gratitude for curiosity, for the ocean, for the strange endurance of ideas. Atlantis never existed, and somehow that made it strong enough to survive everything that did. Out on the horizon, the first ships of the day are tracing thin silver lines across the water. They don't know they're sailing over 2 millennia of speculation. They just follow the sun. And maybe that's the best ending the story could ask for. People still moving forward, still trusting the sea, even after all the warnings. When you open your eyes again, remember how the myth felt, not how it ended. That calm weight of history, the hush after long waves, the quiet pride of things that last only as echoes. Carry that with you, the way sailors once carried bits of home in their pockets, small, heavy reminders of where they came from. Because in the end, that's all Atlantis ever was, a pocket full of wonder that refused to sink. Now the story fades. The sea goes back to its ordinary business. The narrator falls silent, and somewhere, in a place that is both real and not, a city opens its eyes, just long enough to smile at the thought that someone, somewhere, still remembers its name. Sleep now, or wake. Either way, the tide will carry you. Atlantis will wait.